Words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight. Oh God, you are our strength and our Redeemer. God, I pray that my words will not only be mine, oh God, but yours. Amen. So if I ask you right now, what does the nation need? And we started a conversation. If I ask you that question, what does the nation need? Instead of having a sermon, we're all going to gather around and have a conversation about that. Odds are, about 5 minutes in, everyone would be arguing, right? What does the nation need? And we'd all gather around. We're all Christians here, but we still have different opinions, and we'd all end up arguing about it, right? One way or another, we'd all end up arguing about something. And odds are, you've been in a situation where your very deeply held beliefs and values got challenged, and you ended up in an argument with someone. I remember the first time that this happened to me was when I was in high school, and it was the first time that I was becoming, politically aware, right? Like aware that there's a world outside of myself, and you can have an opinion on certain things, and you start paying attention to what's going on in the news and to what the political parties are doing for the first time, and then you start to talk about it, right? But usually, you're not very well researched, or you don't know much about it, but you just sort of got an opinion because you heard whatever so-and-so said on the radio or the TV or whatever your parents said, right? And my best friend in the whole world, he's still my best friend in the whole world, but this didn't end our friendship, right? We were just on a pilgrimage. We were just walking down the road in Tyler. We would just do that and go on these prayer walks. And of course, we end up talking about politics. And I found out that he disagreed with me, that he did not hold the same political views that I did. And it was like being betrayed. It was like my best friend had betrayed me. I was like, how? What? Because, we have a bias that we think people who we identify with us automatically agree with us. We automatically assume people who we think are like us agree with us on everything, right? So like when your best friend, it turns out that they don't agree with you, you're like, what? How can you think that, you crazy person? I thought we were all rational, good people, but turns out you're a moron, right? Because we all think we're right, and sometimes we just can't understand people who disagree with us. And I remember that my anger came from not only being betrayed, but also, as I reflect back on it, my anger came from being incredibly ill-informed. The more ill-informed you are, the more angry you get about things. You ever notice that? Because you don't know what you're talking about. And so you just revert to emotion because that's what you got, right? You feel strongly about it. You may not know what you're talking about, but you sure feel strongly about it. And that's where I was. I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't know anything about public policy or economics or anything like that. I still don't really know that much about it, right? But I was so mad. I remember having this walking stick, and I turned around, and we're like on the side of the highway in Tyler, and I just start banging that stick on the ground. I'm so mad, and it breaks in half. And my friend Steven turns to me and he goes, well, now you broke your stick. And I got so mad at him, I threw the stick pieces at him. It was like, he forgave me for throwing the stick pieces at him. But it made me mad, and odds are, maybe you didn't throw something at somebody or stick pieces or break your stick, but odds are you've been in a conversation like that with somebody, right? Maybe it's those awkward political conversations at the Thanksgiving table, or it may be around hanging out with your friends and family 4th of July, whatever you do, right? But we have those things. But the question remains, what does the nation need? What does the nation need? And I think, this is just because I'm a pastor, I think the nation needs what God requires. All right? I think the nation needs what God requires. The nation needs what God requires. So what does God require of us? Well, you can read it in those exact words in Micah chapter 6. No, but God has shown you, O mortals, what the Lord requires of you, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I think Don't you think if everybody did that, then we'd be in pretty good shape? Yeah, I think so. To understand this kind of, to understand this question of what the nation needs, I thought we'd look at what Paul thought his nation needed. All right, Paul was a citizen of the Roman Empire, right? That was his government. It was one of the largest empires that the world had ever known. It was certainly the biggest government that the world had ever seen before. They invented a lot of the way to govern and to do things, and it was the first time in the world that anything had ever been that big. And this, what Molly just read from you, came from Paul's letter to the Romans, right? This is the letter he wrote to the capital where his government was housed, right? And so that's why you have to read the whole thing in context to get what Paul's thinking about, right? Because what's he start with? He starts with giving respect and honor to people. He starts with loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. And who can disagree with that, right? Who can disagree with that we're supposed to love our enemies? We might agree that it's really hard, but most of us as Christians would agree that we're supposed to do that, right? And he says he says, save vengeance for God says vengeance is mine, right? So that's like, just don't even worry about revenge or avenging yourself, because you can let God do that. That's really hard for some people, because if you're hit, what do you want to do? You want to hit back, right? He says that's what you're supposed to do. And then finally he says, love your enemies, because in so doing you will heap burning coals upon their head. And that sounds really bad, right? Like you're throwing hot coals onto people's head. But really what he's talking about is the blacksmith's fire. The top of the fire is called the head. That's where the hottest coals are. That's where you stick the metal in order to reshape it. So what's Paul saying by that? He is saying, if you love your enemies and you pray for them and you're kind to them, that will be the blacksmith forge in how they are reshaped and reformed. The idea of loving your enemies is so that they will be reformed in the fires of your love, that they will take a different shape because they have met you, right? That's what he's saying. We can all kind of get behind that. And then he goes on to this chapter 13. Right after that, he goes to 13. Everybody obey the governing authorities. Now, if you know anything about Paul's political situation and where they were, almost everyone he wrote that to would go, what? And even some of you might balk at that. For the authorities are placed there by God. And you're like, what? And if you balk at that, it's probably because you're American, right? Because we were founded on this idea that we rebelled against the government to start with, right? That's where we came from. We came from this place of suspicion of the ruling authorities and checks and balances. That's why our system works. So when you hear that, you go, what? Okay, for the authorities are placed there by God? I don't know about that. They're there to execute justice, and they're like, what and what? Oh, I don't know. And you're thinking, Paul, have you not viewed what your own government is doing to your own people? Right? Christians in many places are being persecuted by the Roman government. And he says, obey the authorities, for they're put there by God. And I'm sure there's a lot of Christians go, no, what? I don't know. What? Okay. And then he gets on to the part that, man, nobody likes, and you need to pay your taxes. What? That was a big issue in Paul's time too, right? Because where Paul came from, Paul is a Jew, right? He's from Judea. They feel oppressed by the Roman authorities, right? They feel oppressed. They don't feel like Rome is supposed to be there, and they don't feel like they're supposed to have to pay taxes, right? And so that's why, remember the very contentious moment where the Pharisees are trying to get Jesus in trouble with Rome? They go to Jesus and they say, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? Because they're trying to trap him, right? They're trying to trap Jesus because they know Jesus is between a rock and a hard place, right? If Jesus agrees with his people, he would say, you shouldn't pay your taxes because the taxes go to this pagan government that's unrighteous and yada, 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 right? And they're like, well, he's not a real man of faith. He's just a Roman sympathizer, right? But if he doesn't say you should pay your taxes, if he says, no, don't pay your taxes because the Romans are a pagan, what are they going to say? Oh, he's starting a rebellion. That's what they ended up saying anyway, right? Oh, he's starting a rebellion, crucify him, right? They had him in a rock and a hard place. So how does Jesus respond? Whose face is on that coin? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's, right? But the implication there, wink, wink, if you're theologically astute, you know that the Jews believe everything belongs to God, right? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's, because everything is God's, right? He's basically putting Caesar under God there, which is a brilliant way to answer that question, actually, right? Paul's in the same position. He's writing to the Romans who live in the seat of power. So we can't say anything about not obeying them, because the Romans already think this is a subversive, rebellious group of people. But his people are going to expect him to say something like that. How could he support this group that oppresses them? How could he say this for all times and all places? For you don't have anything to worry about if you're being good. The authorities won't bother you if you're being good. And on a general level, we all know that's pretty much true for the most part. For the most part, if you pay your taxes and you behave well, you're not going to get in any kind of trouble. And that's really good advice for Christians living in Rome, because the Christians in Rome can't afford to draw attention to themselves, right? They already have this bias against them. And so they just have to act right and be good, and they won't draw attention to themselves. But in another way, we know, because we worship the guy who got himself crucified for doing good. He was crucified by the authorities. And so you know, that doesn't always hold true. It almost seems contradictory for him to say that. And so when you read that, it's kind of like having whiplash. Like, what? I don't. And then he starts on this thing about paying taxes, and who likes paying taxes, right? He's paying taxes, and then he rolls it in from paying taxes specifically, right, to this more general thing: give to everyone what is due to them. So the government's due its taxes. Give to everyone what is due to them. Honor to whom honor is due. Respect to whom respect is due. Revenue to whom revenue is due. That means pay for stuff. Don't take it, right? Give to everyone for whom is due. Honor to whom honor is due. Respect to whom respect is due. Revenue to whom revenue is due. And then he goes on. Don't leave any debt unpaid, except for the debt of love for one another. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says, for you can never finish repaying that. You always owe love to one another. You owe love to one another. And love for one another fulfills all the requirements of the law. For the laws against stealing, killing, adultery, all those things are summed up in this simple commandment that you love your neighbor as yourself. So do you see what Paul does there? Paul knows that they're going to be, whatever he writes about this is going to be unpopular to somebody, because the people who he is writing to are divided. Just like we're divided today about what the role of government might be, about how much respect and authority you give to government, about what government should and shouldn't do. And he's writing to these people who are going to have strong opinions about it in the capital. He's writing to people who you get in trouble with. So Paul decides to go with what always works. And what always works is what God requires. That's what he sticks with. What does God require? Because whatever God requires is what the nation needs. And it's based off of this idea that we owe each other something. We all owe each other something. We are all in debt to one another. Because give to God what is God's. What is God's? Everything. So you are in debt. We are all in debt. Did you know that? It doesn't matter if you have all your bills paid. It doesn't matter if your student loans are paid off. It doesn't matter if your car note's paid off. It doesn't matter if your house is paid for. You're in debt. You know why you're in debt? You're in debt because God has loved you. God has given you everything you have ever said was yours. God has loved you beyond measure. God has sacrificed God's only Son for you. You are in debt. And the way that you pay back your debt to God is by loving one another. How else are you going to do it? What else does God want? That's what the prophet Micah says. With what shall I come before the Lord? With thousands of jars of oil? With bulls and rams and sheep? And all of these things? With what can I worship the Lord? No, He has shown you, O mortal, what the Lord requires of you, what you owe God. Here is the bill. And the bill is to love mercy and to do justly and to walk humbly with your God. And so that it never matters what government situation we find ourselves in or who is in office or whether we live in the United States of America or whether we live in Australia or China or whatever, that never changes. We are always in debt to one another and we always owe each other love. We always owe each other respect. We always owe each other to treat one another with justice. Because that's how we love God. That's how you pay back God on your debt. You love one another. And you know, we live in a time now, and we hear about this all the time, because it's a talking point now. We live in a time where people talk about demonizing the other side, certain liberals will demonize conservatives and conservatives will demonize liberals and all that kind of stuff. Because it's easy to argue with one another when you think the other person's a monster or a demon or something like that. I'm sorry, it's just not right. That's not respect. It doesn't matter if you disagree with one another. You've got to respect one another. It doesn't matter. You may think that person has like the worst view ever. You may think their view is monstrous, but you owe them respect because you owe them love. That's what you owe. It doesn't matter. Does it say love everyone who's not your enemy in chapter 12? No, love your enemies. How are you ever going to reshape your enemies if you don't love them? Because you owe them that anyway. I don't hear anybody in the current political conversation saying what Paul's saying. I don't hear anybody saying that. But we know, we're Christians, that that's what the nation needs. The nation needs what God requires. We need to be respecting one another and loving one another. Or this whole American thing doesn't work. And it's not going to work if we're liberal monsters and conservative monsters. It doesn't work that way. Because you know what monsters do? They fight. And a lot of politicians will give lip service to that idea. But this is what the nation requires. That we respect one another. That we love one another. And I hear way too many people today in our current political conversation talking about what they can do. What they have the right to do. Yeah, you have the right to say whatever you want. You have the right to think whatever you want. But I hear far less people talking about what they should do. What should you be doing? Yeah, you have great freedom. You can do whatever you want. But you know who talks about doing whatever they want? Little children. Little children talk about whatever they want. They look forward to the day when they can stay up all night and eat ice cream and jump on the bed. You can do that, but you shouldn't, because you're going to get sick. But what Paul is talking about is what we should be doing. What does God require of us? What are the shoulds? And you know what? In government, in civics, what we call thinking about what we should do? Citizenship.
citizenship. That's what we call it. Now citizenship almost exclusively gets used as this word that is used for when somebody wants to become a citizen of the United States that isn't currently a citizen. But it used to mean something different. It used to stand for your duties and obligations, the responsibilities that freedom laid upon you. And I hear far too many people talking about what their rights and freedoms are, and not enough people talking about what their responsibilities are. What should you be doing? And you know what Paul says? Paul says that good citizens are people who pay their debts, including the debt that they owe to one another, love and respect. Paul says that the righteous, that good citizens, are not the ones that hold these particular political views, but they're the ones who show the most love and respect to one another. That's how you get proved righteous. Not how right you are on health care or taxes or whatever. That's not what makes you righteous, what opinions you hold. No one's opinion makes them righteous. You're righteous because you pay your debts. You're righteous because you fulfill your obligations to one another. So what does God require and the nation need? God requires people who love. What does the nation need? The nation needs people who love. The nations need citizens who take up their responsibilities. Because at the end of the day, you know what we always say? I tell you, you are the church, right? You are the body of Christ, the presence of God in the world. There is no church without you. If all y'all stop coming and none of you come, is there going to be church? There's going to be this building sitting here with this beautiful stained glass windows, and no one will be here and there'll be no church, will there? The same is true of America. You are America. Each of us citizens of the United States of America. It's as good as bad as we are. And so what the nation needs is good citizens who pay their debt of love to one another. And at the end of the day, I think about the nation in the same way that I think about this table. Because what has God done? God has gathered us in His love, out of His sacrifice for us, has paid our debt for us when we couldn't pay it. Gathered around this table and said, it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, that you can gather around this table. And I think about my country the same way. It doesn't matter what a political opinion you hold or how patriotic you are on the 4th of July or whatever, because you're still an American. You gather around this table bound together by these common threads. And if nothing else, I am bound together by the common thread that I have been loved by God. And that means that you deserve to be loved by me.